Joshua chapter 17. We're going to study out of that chapter tonight. Brother BJ asked me if I'd fill in for him tonight, and I said, I have a lecture that I presented at the Firm Foundation Lectures probably 25 or 30 years ago. The lecture series was on the book of Joshua. This was the chapter that I was assigned. And I said, unless you really want to teach that chapter, I'd love to teach it. He said, that'd be great, be helpful to him. So it's just about as far as he had gotten. I think he was in chapter 16. And I'm going to look back into chapter 15 and 16 as well to maybe set some background. The lectureship is just barely a month away, a month and 1 week, I think it is. And let me encourage you to pick up a flyer and set your schedule so that you can come to as many of these as possible. If you've never been heavily involved in lectureship, it's really enriching, it's uplifting, and make plans to be here for every session that you can be here for. I think you'll. In fact, I've looked at the topic lessons, and they're just tremendous. Let me review a little bit. I don't have Google Maps. I don't even have Giggle Maps up there. But BJ and so many others, they do such a great job with PowerPoint and things like Google Maps. But you remember last week that he showed us a map of the layout of the tribes. And to the north of what we consider the basic land of Canaan was a huge swath of land that had been cut out from Manasseh. And you cross over the Jordan, there's another huge swath of land. And BJ had made reference to the fact that the tribes of Manasseh and Ephraim had actually come to Joshua and said, we want more land. And I think there are some great lessons to come out of that. Go back to chapter 15 and verse 63 for just a minute and reflect on everything you've studied in Joshua and the lessons we've shared. One thing that stands out with regard to Israel, and especially their responsibility to completely obey everything that God had told them to obey, is the fact that they fell short, particularly in the area of driving out the inhabitants of Canaan. And that would come back to bite them, would it not? Look at chapter 15, verse 63. And as for the Jebusites, the inhabitants of Jerusalem, the children of Judah could not drive them out. But the Jebusites dwell with the children of Judah at Jerusalem unto this day. Go over to chapter 16. And look, if you will, the last verse in chapter 16. And they drove not out the Canaanites that dwelt in Gezer, but the Canaanites dwell in the midst of Ephraim unto this day, and are become servants to do task work. Simple fact is, they're still there, are they not? And become a hindrance to the full development of Israel, I think to the full extent that God intended for them. Now move over to chapter 17 and move down to verse 12. You have the same thought, yet the children of Manasseh could not drive out the inhabitants of those cities, but the Canaanites would dwell in that land, and it came to pass that when the children of Israel were waxed strong, that they put the Canaanites to task work and did not utterly drive them out. If you'll keep that background in mind, I think you may have a greater appreciation for the things that these leaders in Manasseh and in Ephraim, some of the requests that they were making. For the text tonight, we're going to use verses 14 to the close of the chapter. And after we've read this, we're going to go back to just sort of lay some background, and then we're going to return to this and draw out some important lessons based particularly on a great phrase that is made by the children of Manasseh. Start reading with verse 14. And the children of Joseph spake unto Joshua, saying, Why hast thou given me but one lot, and one part for an inheritance? Will you stop there for just a minute? I think they got two parts, did they not? one on the east side of the Jordan, one on the left side. And when you compare what they received with everybody else, the mass and land was a lot larger than the other tribes. Some of the tribes combined did not even measure up to what they had received. Now I understand that the land was probably allotted to a large degree based on the population of that tribe. But still, nonetheless, that was an incredible amount of land that they were given. Now let's read a little bit further. They asked for this lot, this more than one lot, sing, last part of verse 14, sing, I am a great people, for as much as hitherto Jehovah hath blessed me. I'm not going to question their sincerity. I think they, like all the other tribes at that point, under the great leadership of Joshua, they recognized that their greatness was not based upon their own accomplishments. It was based on what God had done for them. Joshua reminded them of that repeatedly. As Joshua was reminded, where on numerous occasions God would say, see, I've given unto you. I've given unto you the land. I've given unto you the city of Jericho. So I think they were appreciative, but when I look at the historical setting and how they failed to fulfill their responsibility in driving out the inhabitants, I think they had a skewed vision of what actually constituted greatness in the sight of God. And therein lays the background for what we're dealing with, and that is that God's measure of greatness is contrary to man's measure of greatness. Think for just a moment, and I'm just going to mention 2 or 3 things, but you could add to this list if we have the time. No doubt you could expand upon it. But greatness is not measured by any of human standards. Take popularity, for example. The Israelites were warned in Deuteronomy chapter 23, Exodus chapter 23 and verse 2, that you're not to follow a multitude to do evil. It's not popularity that determines what's right and wrong. New Testament counterpart of that would be Matthew chapter 7 verses 13 and following, where Jesus talks about the wide gate, the broad way, and how many travel that broad way. Is it many or few? It's many, is it not? Straight is the gate, narrow is the way that leads to life, and few are those that walk therein or follow that route. So popularity is not the standard by which we determine what greatness is. And when I look out across the landscape of the age in which we live, it seems to me that one of the general consensus is if it's popular, if everybody supports it, if it's in agreement with most people, then it must be all right. Well, you've heard others make reference to the time when they were growing up. My mom and dad were no exception to this. It's just part of proper parent raising of children. And like any typical teenager, I would say, but Daddy, everybody's doing it. And he would say, everybody except for you, or my brothers, as far as that goes. Popularity is not the right standard. How we feel about something is not the right standard. And yet, that seems to be one of the standards that people use today. I made reference to Matthew 7, 13 and 14, but move down the page in Matthew chapter 7 and you come to that reference that Jesus makes of those who in that day would say, did we not prophesy in thy name? Did we not do many mighty works, cast out demons in thy name? I have no doubt they were sincere. But sincerity is not the measure of what's right and wrong. Because you see even biblical examples of people I would not impugn their sincerity. They may have thought they were right, but they certainly weren't right. I think King Saul is a good example of that. Was he sincere in a lot of the things that he did that were blatantly wrong in God's sight? Well, absolutely he did. But giving the best to their motives, that still does not become the standard of what constitutes greatness. Another standard that people use, and I'm afraid that at least in the last 30 or 40 years, the Lord's church in a number of places has fallen prey to this, and that is they measure greatness by numbers. It's back in the mid-1980s, and the Brotherhood was cranking up the bus ministries, literally and figuratively. And we were bringing children into worship. Some, I think, went to extremes. They did some things that were, I think, unscriptural. It led in the wrong direction. That fad, if I can use that terminology, that fad ran its course because we realized that we were actually producing a great number of problems that we weren't really solving. But I saw an article in one of the periodicals. It was basically, I'm thinking it was the Gospel Advocate, but the heading on the article was the 10 top churches in the United States. And as I read that list, every single one of the 10, every one of them had some really serious issues in what they were doing. I'm not saying that they were all wrong or that any of them were absolutely pure, but they were struggling within the congregation of things that I would consider doubtful, questionable. But greatness is not it's not measured by numbers. For example, how many did Gideon have in his army? Against how many? 120,000. Have you ever done your math on that? I don't know about you. I'd hate to have to face 10,000 people on my own. But numbers is not the answer. David, when he came into the camp of Israel, when on one side of the ravine or the valley were the Israelites, on the other were the Philistines, and here was this giant who was defying the armies of God. And David said, "Who is this uncircumcised Philistine that he can defy the armies of God?" And as he inquired, he learned, but he came to Goliath with the cause of God in his mind. And he picked up small stones, 5 small stones out of the brook, and prepared himself to face Goliath. He wasn't worried about numbers. Zechariah chapter 4 and verse 6, "Not by power nor by might, but by my word God would accomplish his will." And I can flip back through the passages that Brother Clark has shared with us in this survey of Joshua, and look how many times the armies of Israel were so outnumbered, and yet they were still successful against that enemy, so long as they were walking according to God's will. And so numbers, popularity, those are not the measuring stick. Now, before I get to the actual 3 points, I know this is a lengthy introduction, but sometimes, well, maybe I should have made a 4th point on this. But I want to think for just a minute about some genuine earmarks of God's people. What makes God's people a great people? Some genuine earmarks. One of these is submission to God's will. James chapter 4 and verse 20. If you humble yourself in the sight of God, He will lift you up. You'll be considered great. By the way, think about numbers for just a minute. There are congregations spread all across this land and even in foreign countries that are small in number. And even though we don't know who they are, we have no idea what the work is they're doing, they're out there with a determination to maintain loyalty to God and His Word. And they're beating the bushes, knocking the doors, and in God's sight, they are a great people. And that ties in with this. Why? Because they submit to God's will. They're determined, we're going to do everything with a "thus saith the Lord." And if you stay on that path, you're going to be all right. I think another mark of God's people, of great people, is that of genuine sanctification. Turn over to 1 Peter chapter 2 for a moment. Sanctification comes from the same root word out of which we get our word sanctified or holy, being set apart for a particular purpose. But the word itself describes a relationship with something. If I'm looking at my relationship to God, and I'm therefore thinking about being a holy people, as in 1 Peter chapter 2, verses 5 and following, it means I'm a person who's set aside. I'm different. If it comes to my morals, my behavior, listen to what Peter writes in 1 Peter chapter 2, verse 11. "Beloved, I beseech you as sojourners and pilgrims to abstain from fleshly lusts, which war against the soul, having your behavior seemly among the Gentiles, that wherein they speak against you as evildoers, they may by your good works, which they behold, glorify God in the day of visitation. Isn't that our desire, is to please God? That God will be magnified. We had an elder at a congregation I worked with, and he was a great teacher, and he would occasionally remind us, he said, our task is to make God look good. And that's exactly what our goal is to make God look good. Turn over to Hebrews chapter 12. I'm still thinking about sanctification. There are some crazy ideas as to how sanctification comes about, but the bottom line is it's through obedience to God's will. If we obey His will, we will be a holy priesthood, a royal nation, a people for God's own possession. Hebrews chapter 12, verse 14. Follow after peace with all men. Now listen to this. And the sanctification without which no man shall see the Lord. You want to know what the earmark of a great people is? They are a people who are sanctified. And they do all within their life to incorporate that into their character. Submission to God, sanctification. Here's another character trait of what makes a people great, and that is they are people who serve. Matthew chapter 20, verses 25 and 26 emphasizes that. What about the parable of the 1 talent and the 5 talent and the 2 talent man? What did those who received the accolade from God, well done, thou good and faithful servant? Well, what did they do? They worked, they served, and they did what God would have them to do. Love of the brethren is a mark of being a great people. By this shall all men know that you are my disciples. Brethren, don't pull that passage in John 13 out of its text, out of its context, and say this is the earmark of God's people. It's one of the earmarks of God's people, but it's certainly not the only one. I guess you could say if we use agape love, it'll filter over into the other areas. But all of these are various marks of what makes a people a great people. Pure religion, James 1 verse 27, is this: to visit the orphans and the widows in their affliction, and to keep oneself unspotted from the world. You see how the Bible's definition of greatness is so much different than the world's definition of greatness. And our goal ought to be, I'm going to strive to be great according to God's will. And this chapter lends itself to that. Now what I want you to see tonight is Joshua's response to this request on the part of Ephraim and Manasseh for this extra lot of land. Let's go back to chapter 17, verse 14. Let's just read the text. I think what I'll do is just read this and stop along the way to make the points. And the children of Joseph spake unto Joshua, which both of the tribes were involved in this request, because when you move down to verse 17, you see Joshua responding to both tribes. One may have been the spokesman at one moment, but both tribes were requesting this. Said, why hast thou given me but one lot and one part for inheritance, seeing that I am a great people, for as much as hitherto Jehovah hath blessed me? Now watch Joshua's answer, and you have to love this. And Joshua said to them, if thou be a great people, you claim to be great? Let's see if you really are. If thou be a great people, get thee up into the forest, and cut down for thyself there in the land of the Perizzites and of the Rephaim, since the hill country of Ephraim is too narrow for thee. And the children of Joseph said, the hill country is not enough for us. And all the Canaanites that dwell in the land of the valley had chariots of iron and so forth. But that 15th verse, if you be a great people, you get up into the forest, land that they already had been granted by God. And here's the lesson, that great people utilize what God has placed within their hands. They utilize what God has placed within their hands. So many times, because of the fact we don't pray for wisdom, we don't see those things that God has placed in our hands. So let me just jog your thinking a little bit here. If you think about Exodus chapter 4 and verse 2, Moses is about to return to Egypt and go before Pharaoh. And how shall they know that you're the one that sent me? And he said, Moses, what is that in your hand? What was it in his hand? It's a staff, a rod. That's all it was. But God used that for a great purpose. And so he had within his hand the ability to convince them, not by himself, certainly. I think I'm speaking to an audience to understand we're not talking about self-human power. We're talking about what God has given us that he can utilize, if I'll make sure I put it to work. 2 Kings chapter 2 and verse 14. Well, I'm going to have to jog my own memory on this. 2 Kings chapter 2 and verse 14 is another example, but if you were to ask me right now what it is, I wouldn't have any idea. Now I remember looking at the chapter. Elisha is about to take the place of Elijah. And as Elijah is taken up into heaven by this whirlwind, Elisha then, if you'll start with verse 9, it came to pass, I'm in 2 Kings 2 verse 9, that when they were gone over, that Elijah said unto Elisha, ask what I shall do for thee before I am taken from thee. And Elisha said, I pray thee, let a double portion of thy spirit be upon me. And he said, thou hast asked a hard thing. Nevertheless, if thou see me when I am taken from thee, it shall be so unto thee. But if not, it shall not be so. It came to pass as they still went on and talked, that behold, there appeared a chariot of fire and horses of fire. They carried up Elijah. Now watch, if you will, in verse 12, the middle of verse 12. And he saw him no more, and he took hold of his own clothes, rent them in two pieces, and watch 13. He took up the mantle of Elijah that fell from him, and went back and stood by the bank of the Jordan. And he took the mantle of Elijah that fell from him, and he smote the waters. It's the same lesson. He took what God had given him in his hands, and he utilized that for the purpose of God. Matthew 25, I made reference to the one-talent man, the two-talent man, and the five-talent man. They took what God had given to them, and they used that. They did not bury it in the ground. Here's the challenge to you and I. Look at how many things God has given to us. He's given us the gospel, for one thing. The power unto salvation. How are we using that? Are we being good stewards? As Paul said, a man who's going to be faithful, God wants him to be a good steward. Think about our material resources for just a moment. The brotherhood in this country is richer by far than any other country in this world. I don't think there's any hesitancy to make that statement. And yet, how are we using what God has given to us? Are we using it to further the gospel, or to maybe increase the creature comforts in our house? Maybe I've shared this story with you several years ago when I was in the process of changing congregations. I was visiting various congregations, some to raise mission funds for the work in India, some to try out. I don't like that term, try out, but you get the idea. And there was a congregation there that I had visited. They had a building that was less than 10 years old. It had a capacity to seat about 250. Their attendance on Sunday morning ran about 120, and Sunday night ran about 9 or 10. I thought that was a fluke. They said, no, that's about our average attendance. And they had a sign on the wall where the Lake Cleon Lyles used to call that the scoreboard. And they had a sign, building fund, $158,000. And I said, I need some money for mission work. And they would not contribute one penny to our mission work. So that night, when I preached, I said, you need to close this account out and get on with the Lord's work. I never got invited back to that congregation. But you know, when I visited in the home of one of the members during the afternoon. I found out why that congregation thought that way, because their leaders did. And this brother, on the wall of his house, we started around the living room area, just he would go by and he'd show me this little item he had framed hanging on his wall. He said, "This is a slip of paper that I bought at an auction." He said, "That's Abraham Lincoln's real signature on that." He said, "I bought that for $15,000. He showed me some stamps in a frame. Each one of the stamps were unique. 2,000 for this one, 1,000 for that one, 4,000 for this one. Well, I started adding the figures up. And by the time we had walked all the way around that room, I had calculated about $250,000 to $500,000 hanging on the wall. And it's all going to be burned up. It's all going to be burned up. What are we doing with what God has placed in our hands? Here's the second lesson. If you'll move down into verse 12, or go back to verse 12, here's the second lesson. Great people of God stand firm against those who would destroy the kingdom. I'm not suggesting that we become unbalanced in that, but brethren, how can God's people not recognize that there are enemies out there? Paul said in Philippians chapter 3 that there are those who serve their own bellies. He refers to them as the dogs, concision, but to close our eyes and say there are no enemies out there is to simply deny what the truth is. Satan himself takes on the appearance of an angel of light, so do his ministers, but they have no intention of doing good to the cause of Christ. Their intention is to do evil. And so the Bible is replete with examples and admonitions where we are to don the armor of God. We are to be on the offensive, not intentionally being offensive as if we're rude and unkind, but we are to be offensive. We are to serve as a good soldier of Christ Jesus. 2 Timothy chapter 2 verse 3. We are to put on the armor of God. Ephesians chapter 6, we're to contend earnestly for the faith. And when I look back at this 12th verse and I see the people that were there, the children of Israel could not drive out the inhabitants of those cities. I've often wondered why. Did they just wait too long until those people became encamped and just they had taken up a position and now they were difficult to drive out? You know, error works the same way in the body of Christ. When error raises its ugly head, it needs to be dealt with, whether it's error in false doctrine, whether it's ungodly behavior in a congregation. That's why God gave us the directions with regard to discipline. That's exactly why they're there. And I've served in enough congregations to know that it works when the elders take the lead in disciplinary action. I know it works. I've seen it work. Of course, even if I'd never seen it, I'd still tell you it works because it's divine wisdom, is it not? And so great people, they stand fast against the enemies of God. They're going to do all that they can to maintain the purity of the body of Christ and to drive out the enemies. Ours is a spiritual battle. Joshua's, to some extent, was spiritual, but it was very physical. They were literally fighting in the streets, if you will. But our battle is no less a serious battle, is it? In fact, in many respects, it's a greater battle. That we are to bring into subjection every thought and every imagination. We're fighting against the principalities and the powers in heavenly places. And if somehow we could have the curtains split open where we could see the host of spiritual darkness that are there, we may be like that servant when Elijah said, "God, will you open his eyes?" And he could then see the spiritual hosts of God. And I think we would tremble sometimes if we saw the force of wickedness that we are fighting. They're real. And it's being played out on the stage of life. How can you look at what's happening in our society and not believe that? When a governor says we're going to allow babies to be born, put them on the table, we're going to keep them comfortable, and then we're going to talk to the doctor and the mother whether we ought to put that baby to death or not. That's infanticide, brother. I don't know of any other nation in this whole world that's ever upheld that. Don't tell me there are forces of evil are not at work. Let me give you one last character trait. If you move down to verses 17 and 18, a great people have the faith that God will give the victory. Even though you can't see it with the human eye, you still believe that. Verse 17, Joshua spake unto the house of Joseph, even to Ephraim and Manasseh. You see, both tribes were involved in this, saying, Thou art a great people. Isn't that a curious response? If we are a great people, if you are a great people, and then he goes so far as to say, Thou art a great people, and you have great power. Thou shalt not have one lot only, but the hill country shall be thine. For though it is a forest, thou shalt cut it down, and the goings out thereof shall be thine. For thou shalt drive out the Canaanites, though they have chariots of iron, and though they are strong. What I want you to see in this is that Joshua, he could see what the children of Ephraim and Manasseh could see. The chariots of iron. The enemy encamped in the land. He could see that with the physical eye. But he saw much more than that. And it was with the eye of faith that he could see the possibilities that were there. Forest Hill, well, in fact, any congregation of God's people will be successful if they have the eye of faith. They can see the unseen and realize that God is on their side and that ultimately victory will be ours. We'll have skirmishes, we'll have the battles that come along, we'll have those moments when we feel like maybe we're being defeated, but the eye of faith says, I'm going to look at the unseen. Now, let me just look at a couple of passages with you. Turn over to Colossians chapter 3. And this very epistle is designed to elevate the great superiority of Christ. It lifts him up as the preeminent one. And it warns against the philosophies of men that would lead us astray. Now listen to chapter 3, verse 1. If then you were raised together with Christ, seek the things that are above, where Christ is seated on the right hand of God. Set your mind on things that are above and not on the things that are upon the earth. What is Paul saying? You've got to, with faith, you've got to see the unseen. You've got to set your mind up there on a higher plane than down here on a lower plane. You remember that passage in Isaiah? They that wait upon the Lord shall renew their strength. They shall mount up with wings as eagles. They shall run and not be weary, and walk and shall not faint. That reference to the eagles is a beautiful illustration. If you've never seen an eagle fly, it's an amazing thing to behold. I'm talking about a bald eagle. Not that he doesn't have any hair on his head, but you know what I'm referring to. He lifts up and he gets up above the earth and he can look down. What's he doing when he's lifted up? He can see things at a broader scale. Our tendency is to become myopic in our vision, to see this, to focus on one thing. Things are bad in Washington. Look how bad it is. Let's get the broader perspective, brethren. Go read the book of Daniel and Isaiah and Ezekiel and see if you don't walk away with an appreciation of God's intervention in the affairs of man. Get your eyes up out of the low places and get them up where Christ is, seated at the right hand of God. Turn over to the book of Hebrews. This is Hebrews chapter 11. Is the bell rung yet? This whole chapter is a chapter that focuses on things that are unseen. If I had the time, we'd look at each one of these. What about Abel and his sacrifice? He could see what acceptable worship was in the sight of God. He knew what it was, because he looked at the unseen and the reward that would be his. But the one that really impresses me is Abraham. And there are two things about Abraham that are said. One of these is, you're going to have children, even though you're past age, and Sarah is beyond the age of bearing children. Look at verses 11 and 12. Let's just read a little bit. Hebrews 11. By faith, even Sarah herself received power to conceive seed when she was past age, since she counted him faithful who had promised. Wherefore also there sprang of one and him as good as dead, so many as the stars of heaven in multitude, and as the sand which is by the seashore innumerable. Why was Abraham considered the father of the faithful? It's because he looked beyond the circumstances. He looked beyond human possibilities. And faith, hoping against hope, is how Paul puts it in Romans chapter 4. He trusted in the unseen. Move down to verse 13. Listen to what the Hebrews writer, this is sort of a summation that I think captures all these characters in Hebrews 11. These all died in faith, not having received the promises, but having seen them and greeted them from afar, and having confessed that they were strangers and pilgrims on the earth. For they that say such things make it manifest that they are seeking after a country of their own. And if indeed they had been mindful of that country from which they went out, they would have had opportunity to return. Don't put your hand to the plow and look back. Because if you do, the devil will open a door of opportunity for you to step through and go back. Don't do it. But now listen to this. But now they desire a better country, that is a heavenly. Wherefore God is not ashamed to be called their God, for He hath prepared for them a city. Isn't that the same thing that you have here in Joshua, when Joshua says to these two people, you are a great people. But I want you to look at the enemy with their chariots of iron, and you look beyond that. I want you to look at the forest that's there and look beyond what you see with the physical eye. You focus on the spiritual things, and God will grant that. That's played out in the trust that we put in God. Seek ye first the kingdom of God and His righteousness, and all these things will be added. Do you really believe that? I was studying about God's providential care one time in a Bible class, and the point that I was trying to make is I trust explicitly in God's providential care. I do more now than I did then. And I said the point is that God has said He will care for you. Don't put yourself in a position, whether it's for occupation, for family, for marriage, for anything. Don't put yourself in a position where you will endanger yourself to be tempted not to put God first. Put Him first and He'll take care of everything. And I'm talking to a group of people who no doubt have seen that in their own lives. I can tell you at least a half a dozen stories in my own life where when I thought there was no end in sight, no way out of this, I just walked away from it and said, God, let me show you one more example about Abraham. Hebrews 11, verse 17. The last bell just rang. Well, I won't show this.